Hey, what's up YouTube? Welcome to this overview of my Tallon Overworld Speed model that I did for Blender Nation's weekend contest a few months back. So I've been getting a lot of questions through comments and messages, mainly messages for some reason, which I find really weird. But basically they've been asking about little techniques that I used here and there during the modeling of the scene, and so I thought I'd address all of those in one video. So the first thing I did, even though I've played Metroid Prime more times than I can count, and it's literally my favorite game of all time, the first thing I had to do was go through and gather reference images. And while I have a GameCube in my desk that I use pretty much only to play Metroid Prime, I use Dolphin for this. If you look at the bottom of the screen, you'll see that I always have Dolphin running in the video. And that is because Dolphin has a free cam mode, which allows you to fly above the map and take screenshots. Well, what I did was I flew about halfway up, and then I took a bunch of smaller screenshots and stitched them together in Photoshop. The reason I did this instead of flying up really high and taking one big high-resolution screenshot is because if you take them from smaller, different angles, then when you stitch them together, it looks more orthographic. Instead of one big perspective shot, you have an orthographic one, which is better for tracing and stuff like that, and getting your aspect ratios and stuff like that right. So after I took all those screenshots, I stitched them together in Photoshop and brought that over into Blender. Now, as far as modeling the scene, I started out just using some basic tracing with an extruded vertex and then capping off the polygons with a big n-gon, because I knew I was going to be using the remesh modifier at some point, so I really didn't care about topology anyways. So the original scene in the game is way too big to sort of fit the low poly vibe I wanted, and so what I did was I made the walls really tall. And surprisingly, by contrast, that made the space feel a lot smaller and I guess a lot cozier and fit kind of the vibe I was going for. And while it's something small, for people who are new to things like scene composition and just blocking things out, it's little things like that that can make a big difference in how people perceive your scene. So as for the actual ground, as I said before, there were just n-gons, and then I used the remesh modifier to turn the n-gons into a grid of quads, and then on top of that, I used the decimate modifier to drop the poly count and create that really nice low poly triangulated effect. As for the shading in most of the scene, almost every object uses a derivative of the same shader. So basically the shader takes a base color, which in this case is this green color right over here, and it splits it off into two. It runs one directly into a mix node, which is here, and then the other splits off and goes into a hue and saturation value node, where it drops the saturation to 80% and then raises it to twice the brightness. This means that when we use this Fresnel value right here as the factor input of the mix node to mix between the two, we get this really nice edge highlighting. So if you look at it just the base color, it looks like this. But when we add our edge highlighting, it really helps bring out the shape of the geometry. And again, it's really subtle, but I believe it makes a big difference. The terrain shader works pretty much the same way, except first it takes the grass and rock colors and mixes between them using the custom painted vertex colors that I made. And then it takes a dirt shader, well, not really a shader, but just mixing color values to make a dirt texture. And it mixes between that and the grass and rock texture using the dirt vertex group that I painted as well. And then it takes that and uses that as the base color and runs it through the shader like you saw before, right here, where it takes the hue and saturation, drops it to 50%, and mixes it with the original color based on a Fresnel value. Now, for the column of light that comes out of the top of the ship, that shader is actually a little bit more interesting. And the way it works, if I add an emission shader here to preview this, let me hook this up. It takes the generated coordinates that are by default generated by the cylinder. Looks like this if you turn them into colors. And basically what it does is it takes the generated coordinates, which look like this, and it runs it through a mapping node to rotate it 90 degrees. And then it also takes a Musgrave texture, which looks like this, and adds them together just using a simple mix RGB node. And by mixing those two together, we get this, which looks really cool, looks very trippy, kind of like a lava lamp. But if we use that as the vector for a gradient texture, because by default, our gradient texture just looks like this, a simple gradient texture. Now, if we use the output of that mix RGB as the vector, it distorts it and it rotates it. So it's black on bottom, white on top, and there's that little bit of a gradient. So all that's left to do from now is to use it as a color, or run it through a color ramp, run it through a mix node to just kind of drop out the whites a little, or drop out the blacks a little bit, and then use that as a factor to mix between a yellow emission and a transparent node for a final result of this glowing sort of wavy light effect. And the little glowing particles inside aren't that complex as well. So basically they are just an icosphere, a particle system that emits icospheres. And the shader is a simple emission transparent mix that is using a Fresnel value run through a color ramp. Now this looks cool because as they rotate, it sort of shimmers, especially if there's a lot of them and it's far away. It's an effect that I kind of made by accident. Forgot what I meant to do, but I was trying to do something else. And I came across this, and it worked, so I used it. So the last shader I should mention are these little thrusters at the bottom of Samus's gunship. And they're actually a little more complex than they look, so I'm actually going to walk through how to create those. So I'm going to go File, New, Reload Startup File. Now the way I made these was I added a UV sphere, just 32 by 16, and I deleted the bottom few rows of vertices, not quite halfway down, but a little more than that. And then I extruded them out on the Z-axis, merged them at center, and dragged them down until they made sort of a perfect cone shape. And then what I did was I selected everything, hit Z to go into wireframe, hit Shift D to duplicate, scale it down, and then I'm going to click on one of the outside vertices, hit Control L, and hit H to hide that. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this bottom row of vertices in the center, scale it in, and grab up to just sort of create this shape. And now if I Alt H, you'll see that I now have one object inside the other. So I'm going to click on one of the inside vertices and hit Control L to select all the inside vertices. Go to Material, add New Material. Let's name this Inner Flame. And with those inner vertices selected, click Assign. Now click on one of the outside vertices, hit Control L to select everything. Go over here, add New Material slot, hit New. Let's name this Outer Flame. And with the outer vertices selected, and only the outer vertices selected, click Assign. Now, if we deselect those, click on Inner Flame and hit Select, it should select the Inner Flame. And if we click on if we click on Outer Flame and hit Select, it should select the Outer Flame. Now we can actually set up our materials. Now, actually, first thing I'm going to do, just so we can see, is I'm going to add an environment texture. So I'm going to open, and I'm going to add an HDRI. So this is what it now looks like. I'm just going to preview that little selection. Now, with Outer Flame selected first, I'm going to delete the diffuse and add an Emission Shader. And I'm going to make this a darker orange color. And then I'm going to add a Mix Shader and a Transparent Shader. And now I can use this Mix Shader slider to make the outer flame more transparent and less transparent. So now I'm going to switch to the inner flame. Delete this, add an Emission Shader, and we're going to make this more of a bright yellow. Now, you can stop right now if you want to, because this will be completely adequate. However, there is something that is a little off here, if I make this, instead of an orange, let's make this a blue. You'll see that the orange is tinting, the outer flame is tinting the blue a little bit of orange. So say we want the outer flame to completely leave the inner flame alone. And this becomes a big problem because if I want to make this less transparent, it starts to cover up the inner flame a little bit. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to move these nodes over, and I'm going to duplicate both the transparent and the mix shader by hitting Shift D, hook that up, and then I'm going to add a geometry node. And I'm going to take, or actually I also have to add in an invert node. I'm going to take the back-facing output of the geometry node, put it into the color of the invert, and the out color of the invert into the factor. And now you can see that the inner flame is no longer affecting the blue, or the outer flame is no longer affecting the blue inner flame. So now if we take the blue and we change this back to a yellow, now I can change the transparency of the outer flame however much I want, and the inner flame stays the same no matter how I rotate around it. So if I can make the inner flame completely opaque, and I can still see the inner flame through it. So anyways, guys, I hope you enjoyed that quick overview of how I made this scene, and I hope you found it really helpful. I ended up finishing the rest of the scene, so instead of just half of it, I modeled the waterfall and I modeled the little lake. And now it's up on Sketchfab, and you will be able to download this in the link in the description below, or view it on Sketchfab if you want. As always, if you have any ideas for future tutorials, be sure to like and leave a comment down in the space below, and I will see you next time.